It's great to be here, and thank you for making the time and the commitment. And my task a little bit today is to talk a little bit more about why bring mindfulness to work. And I actually pose it as a question. So Richie talked about well-being, which is wonderful, and what I'd like to pivot to is mindfulness. And in many ways, mindfulness as a foundation for well-being at work. We know that mindfulness is getting attention everywhere these days. It's in the press. There's a 60-minute piece on it. Science journals publish about it. But what I'd like to do is try to encapsulate the entire reason for why mindfulness is useful at work in 5 seconds. Okay? I think I can actually do this, but I will do it with the aid of some audio-visual. And I will warn you that this audio-visual that's 5 seconds long, that encapsulates the whole reason why mindfulness is useful at work, is spoken in a certain vernacular, which you may or may not appreciate. But at any rate, I will ask for forgiveness rather than permission. And so, why mindfulness at work?
Oh, fuck!
All right, so you can relate to that, right? I assume that's what the laughter's about. Okay. Leading to a situation that's not unlike this. Brains are scrambled. All right. Again, from you, I'd love to hear by show of hands, for example, how many of you would say that the complexity and the demands in your life are increasing? Raise your hand, keep it up for a sec. Take a look around, okay? Now, you can lower your hands. How many of you would say your capacity to meet that rising complexity and demand is increasing at the same rate? Raise your hand. Take a look around. I see like 3 or 4 hands. Okay, and congratulations to you. It's actually a high level of attainment, so you might want to talk to your friends there. Okay, there is this quality of contemporary living where the demands seem to be outsized. I heard a statistic recently that 90% of the data that humans possess in our knowledge base, collectively as a species, has been created in the last 2 years. Right? So how do we, and this comes from a big cloud computing company, so how do we consume that? How do I digest that? How do we navigate that? And could it be that, as McKinsey Quarterly suggests, that always-on multitasking work environments are killing productivity, dampening creativity, and making us unhappy? Okay? Now, some of you may agree with this statement, some of you may not, but it seems that qualitatively we are challenged. Okay? But let's move from the qualitative discussion of why mindfulness is a useful set of skills and capacities to cultivate at work to the quantitative discussion. So let's look at some numbers relative to business. Now, in the dialect known as corporate vernacular, there's this notion of spans of control and scope of role. It simply means how many folks do you manage and how big is your role. And if you look at the change even in just what is expected of people in the business sector in this particular study. So vertical promotions in 1990, you had about 11.4. Lots of step function changes, lots of time to kind of get yourself really accustomed to a role and then move on to the next role, and it was fairly predictable. A significant degree less as of just a couple of years ago, 7.1. Okay, so you have to, what I take away from that is you have to kind of digest more, you have to have a greater span and scope quicker. Years per level, you only have a little bit more time to do that, right? From 3.6 to 4.4, just a very little time to kind of basically leapfrog roles and take on more. And companies per career is nearly double. So you have to context switch. You have to switch your organizations. You have to assimilate to new cultures at a 2x rate compared to 1990. Revenue under manage is a multiple, right? Look at that order of magnitude. So a lot more scope. And then CEOs promoted from within, I think that's an interesting statistic because it's increased. What might that suggest? It might suggest that relationality, as Scott Krenz said, the ability to build quality relationships, to collaborate, to influence, to connect across stakeholders is even more important than ever. Collaboration. And finally, the connections to manage, now with all our social media and networks, is also an order of magnitude. So lots more complexity we see in leadership and business. Employee stress is also a problem. So if that's one red button issue, another red button issue is people are suffering for it. As we see from the APA, 74% of the population cite work as a significant stressor. 74% of the people are stressed out by their work, right? 1 in 5 will miss work as a result and 25 days absent, and half of them will consider leaving their jobs. That's pretty appalling, right? How are we supposed to get anything done when half the team wants to go away? Costing businesses roughly $300 billion a year. Employee engagement, which is a measure of how motivated people are, beyond rational measures, but simply an emotional connection and motivation to do your work and be in the company you're in, is at 32%. So 2/3 of our workforce are not engaged. How are we supposed to be productive and get anything done and be happy about our work if 2/3 of the team are disengaged? And really interesting, employee engagement, as many of you know, has been a really fantastic predictor of company performance. And in particular, I love this model out of Towers Watson about sustainable engagement. So it's not simply about being engaged and having an emotional commitment and motivation, but it's also feeling like you're enabled to do your job. And it's being energized by doing your job. I love the definition: individual, physical, interpersonal, and emotional well-being at work. That's what makes for an energized job, for an energized work environment. Now, this isn't just a great theory, because there's concrete results that obtain when you're able to engender sustainable engagement in your workforce. Let's look at the numbers. These are numbers, right, after the study. So EBIT for companies with high sustainable engagement is 2x what it is for companies that simply have engagement. So earnings before taxes, income, and interest and taxes. So is gross profit. It's also a multiple for companies where people are feeling energized. That's the takeaway. For companies where the workforce feels energized, they are more profitable by every index. And total assets in those companies are also a multiple. Pretty impressive, right? Pretty shocking, actually. Now you compare that to 32% engagement, but you also compare this to what we know about engagement and its outcome. So when I was working at Google, we had this philosophy about people, which I think summarizes my point here really well, which is the aim is to create the happiest, healthiest, and most productive workforce on the planet. But you can't get to number 3 if you don't have 1 and 2. So is it the business of business? Is it the business of the workplace to invest in employee well-being, invest in happiness of employees? Well, by all measures, it seems to be, and Google has done quite well by that as well, right? So just a little bit of a benchmark there. But how can mindfulness help in this mix? When we talk about energizing a workforce, when we talk about helping people with stress, helping them manage those ever-increasing demands and ever-increasing complexity. And again, rather than define mindfulness very specifically, I want to suggest, as Richie has and speakers before have also suggested, that mindfulness is a set of useful mental skills that can build capacity. As Dacker said, it's an innate human capacity to exercise mindfulness. And so I want to suggest that these are some of the skills that can be built. The wiring in your brain can actually be rewired, reconfigured, strengthened around these areas of focus and mental clarity, collaboration, etc., creativity, all the way to overall well-being. And we know the neural mechanisms, by the way. And one thing we know is, and I thought this was funny because I thought I'm on stage and showing you a slide of me on stage, so I'm kind of getting meta. But what's interesting is that all these qualities here, we were able to kind of present to a very large audience at the largest technology conference in the world, which is Dreamforce. So we had 6,000 people in the audience for this day of mindfulness, which was the last day of the conference. And 100,000 people, 92,000 people were live streaming this thing. Why? Why the interest in these specific skills? Right? And then what we know is that you see those speakers in the middle, right? Deep mindfulness experts. and prominent people who are exercising these skills. So we know that there's relevancy, but is it even possible? And as Richie suggests, neuroscience tells us that this is a skill, and we could train the brain to develop this skill. And he talked a lot about how, but neuroplasticity is the key mechanism, the ability of the brain to change so that we can engender these skills more fully. Lifelong capacity of the brain to establish new connections and cells. The connections and the cells change depending on what we do. And in these areas, we know that the neural networks, rewire, or we can develop new cells in those areas to boost our capacity for all of these aspects here. Two in particular seem to be really important, which is attention networks, right? Again, our minds wander 47% of the time, according to that Harvard study, right? So how can we enhance our focus? Well, we could actually switch the neural network from the default attention network, which is mind wandering, to the focused attention or the direct attention network. And we can actually rewire those connections so that we can develop that capacity and enhance that capacity. And we also know that in terms of being reactive and stressed by the demands and challenges and stressors that we face, we can also change the structure and function of this mechanism here that allows us to use a little bit more of our thinking brain and perhaps quiet the emotional brain and actually bring the two together to make wise decisions. Right? And we actually see cortical thickness in the areas of the prefrontal cortex after even just 8 weeks in some studies. Now, I do have to say everything here is suggestive. We're seeing this in the literature, in the scientific literature, a lot of which Richie and team pioneered. But that literature is suggestive. I wouldn't say it's definitive. But it's suggestive is compelling to the tune that, again, thousands of people, and especially in the workplace, are now looking at this. So the easiest way to put this is that we can train our brain. We can train our brain for balance and focus and skillful action. Even Pinkman thinks so. All right. Science is now starting to back this up. But what are the organizational benefits? So it's the ability to direct and orient our attention in these specific ways. And if you work your way down that list, because we know about performance and focus and creativity, and that these are all wonderful skills to have. But what I'd also like to call your attention to is something that we opened up here in this conference, which is it also enables wise and compassionate leadership. Not necessarily words you hear in the workplace or in business settings, but I think that needs to change and is starting to change. Because what do we know about wisdom and compassion? If we think about wisdom, it's really the deep understanding of what's good and true, coupled with optimal judgment as to action. So it's decision quality based on what's good and true. And we know that compassion is about reducing suffering, serving the greater good, and being a benefit to all. So those qualities are increasingly important, not only in business, not only in any workplace, but I would submit in the world. And that is not just anecdotal, because leaders who engender those qualities have really marvelous results in the areas in which they lead. Not an exhaustive list here, but we have some extraordinary leaders taking wise and compassionate courses of action that have resulted in some amazing things in the world. We have Angela Merkel, Chancellor Angela Merkel. Forbes rated her the #1 most powerful woman in the world this year. And her decisioning around the immigrant crisis in Europe and her stand was unique. And Germany will now open its doors to 1 million immigrants from war-torn regions this year. Aung San Suu Kyi, as of yesterday, her party won the first democratic election in Myanmar since 1962. The Nobel laureate, who spent 15 years in house arrest in peaceful protest, has prevailed. If you don't know the gentleman in the middle, these are awesome guys, right? This is Ali, Andy, and Atman from the Holistic Life Foundation. And what started as a mindfulness and well-being program in their high school in inner city Baltimore with 20 kids in detention has now blossomed, and now they train 1,500 kids a week in mindfulness and well-being practices, bringing compassion to their neighborhood. Rose Macario, who's the CEO of Patagonia, which is a B Corp, which does things like make most of its fleece jackets out of recycled soda bottles and plastics, which takes a firm stand and even tells people not to buy their products, right? Truly compassionate approach to business, and one that gets results. Let's not forget that. Because in her time as CEO, revenues have tripled, and Patagonia is experiencing its largest growth this year in its entire history. And Jeff Weiner at LinkedIn, who says the #1 leadership competency is compassion. And finally, Mark Benioff, who has a really compelling model of compassionate philanthropy and leadership. 1-1-1. 1% of all company revenues, 1% of all employees' time, 1% of all employee equity goes to philanthropy. And to date, he's underwrote a children's hospital just down the road in Oakland and one in San Francisco to a tune of $250 million, $6 million to San Francisco Unified School District in this year alone for STEM teachers, science, technology, engineering, and math teachers. So, you know, there are these leaders in the world, whether in business, in not-for-profit, community, or government, that embody compassion. And that's something that I would just like to invite here as we consider mindfulness at work. That mindfulness in many ways can serve as a foundation to activate compassion. And I don't even know if that's linear. One leads to the other. One might even say that the two together can affect transformation. And real transformation in terms of both success by standard metrics and success in terms of being of benefit and service to all. Okay, a very few metrics on the ROI of mindfulness, which is that at Aetna, we know that over 12,000 employees have taken mindfulness programs, 62 minutes on average saved, $3,000 per employee. That's a lot of money. We also know that increasing mindfulness in the workplace, as you see here, reduces employee turnover, sick leave, and it enhances performance and productivity. Again, these are not definitive studies. You have to look at the sample sizes. It's not randomized controlled, but they're suggestive, and they're very encouraging results. And finally, some of our work, actually we're going to show this later. We can talk about that later. At Ford Motor Company, we see some of these results as well. Now, just a couple of last things before I end. I need to bust some myths about mindfulness in business. All right? It's not yes, that is the dude from Big Lebowski. All right? It's not passive, it's not religious, but credit where credit is due. Mindfulness practices, as we know, derive from a long tradition of practices, aeons old, from both the East and the West. Every major religion has a contemplative component to it, which I would submit find their way into what we are calling mindfulness practice today in a secular and science-based manner. So it's not religious and no incense is required. Sorry, dude. Okay, and finally, ending on a quote from Bill George, Harvard Business School professor, former CEO of Medtronic. The main business case is that if you're fully present on the job, you'll be more effective as a leader, you'll make better decisions, and you'll work better with other people.